sounds so simple, doesn't it? But threading your needle can actually be quite tricky. You definitely get better as you go, but I wanted to give you some tips. So first of all, look at what size needle you're using. Now, embroidery needles are generally size 5 to 10.
And the smaller the number, the larger the needle size.
6 seems to be standard, but let's have a look here. So the needle I'm pulling out here is size 9. So that's on the larger end of what you'll find in called embroidery needles. And this is size 3, which is also an embroidery needle. And look at the size difference. I can tell you right now which one I would rather be using, and that's the 9. We often use more strands of floss in modern embroidery, so you'll often be working with the full 6 strands, so it's definitely handier if you use the larger sizes. Sometimes I even use bigger, but I'd suggest getting a multi-pack like I've got here, and that way you can have a play and figure out which needle suits you best, especially if you're using up to 6 strands of floss. Now the next thing to look at is actually tips on threading your needle. So first of all, think about how many strands of floss you'll be using.
So this is 1 strand of floss here compared to 6 strands you see here.
And I can use a much smaller needle with the single strand versus I want a larger needle when I'm using more strands of floss. Now you want really good lighting when you're trying to thread your needle, which isn't often that helpful in the evenings, but you can always use your phone for a light or hold it up to one of your lights. Now snip off the end that you're going to be working with so that it's got a nice clean cut. That makes life a bit easier from the get-go. Now I'm just going to show you here trying to thread this needle. I find it quite hard to thread my needle without wetting it, so I often will just lick the end of the thread, and that is probably frowned upon in the traditionalist embroidery world, but to me it just makes it so much easier. And I know that lots of my members do it too. So hey, let's make life as easy as possible. And look at that, straight through. Ta-da! Another option I know people swear by is to fold over the end and hold it tightly in your fingers, and then you actually poke the folded thread through the eye of the needle, and that can work well. You can also use needle threaders, these handy little tools. So just poke the wire end through the eye of the needle, just like so. And then hold it there with one hand. You kind of have to hold it firmly with the needle, and then use your other hand to poke the thread through the loop in the wire, and then pull the tool back, dragging the thread with you, and it helps if you actually pinch the wire to hold it in place. And look at that, just so easy. So these are really handy when you're using 3 strands of floss or less. Once you're using more strands of floss, they're a little bit weak, especially if you don't have a big enough eye in your needle. So I'll get this ready to show you with 6 strands of floss. So poke the wire end into the eye of the needle. Then I'm going to pop all 6 strands of floss through the wire end. When you go to pull it back through, it just breaks. So frustrating. So they often just won't work with 6 strands of floss unless you've got quite a decent sized needle. But let me show you a trick that will help. So do what you just did, but when you pull the needle threader tool back through, hold it really firmly where the wire meets the plastic part. So hold it really firmly there to give it some more strength, and then just kind of wriggle it back through. And if you're lucky, like I am here, it will pull the thread through all 6 strands, and that is just so helpful. So these tools are optional, but you just might find they're quite helpful. And lastly, let's look at another tool, which is a 3-in-1 needle threader. The top's just the same as what we've used, and then on the sides are these metal hooks. So these are quite good for if you're using more strands of floss, but you do need a needle that has an eye big enough to push the hook through without having to angle it. So it needs to kind of go through straight. So I'll show you how to use one of these. It's basically the same technique. Poke the hook through the eye of the needle, loop your thread around it, and then pull the threader back, and it will drag your thread with it using the hook. So there's some tips on threading your needle.